There is a dangerous mistake people make about quiet old men. They confuse a peaceful demeanor with a lack of power. When a 22-year-old arrogant clerk decided to humiliate an elderly veteran in a high-end boutique, he thought he was just bullying a nobody. He didn't know the old man's faded jacket held a history that terrified foreign armies, and he certainly didn't expect the most powerful four-star general in the Pentagon to walk through those doors, snap a salute, and call the old man Sir. Arthur Donovan stood on the cobblestone sidewalk of M Street in Georgetown, the humid Washington, D.C. air pressing against his weathered face. He was 78 years old, his posture slightly stooped from the invisible weight of decades only a few men truly understood. His right knee throbbed with a dull, familiar ache, a permanent souvenir from the Ashau Valley in 1969. But Arthur wasn't one to complain. He had survived when so many others hadn't, and that meant he owed them the courtesy of living quietly without fuss. Today, however, required a fuss. In his gnarled, arthritis-swollen hand, Arthur held a crumpled piece of paper. It was an invitation, though it felt more like a summons to Arlington National Cemetery. His old company commander, Captain William Henderson, had finally lost his long battle with cancer. William was the man who had pulled Arthur out of a burning personnel's carrier when they were barely more than boys. Arthur owed William his life, and he intended to send him off with the absolute utmost respect. There was just one problem. Arthur's dress uniform had been ruined in a basement flood 3 years prior, and his only civilian suit swallowed him whole after he'd lost 30 pounds to a recent bout of pneumonia. He needed a dark, perfectly fitted suit. He needed it to be impeccable, and he needed it by Friday. He looked up at the gold leaf lettering on the dark glass of the storefront Wellington and Croft, bespoke tailors since 1922. Arthur pushed the heavy brass door handle. The chime that rang out was low, resonant, and expensive. Inside, the air was cool, smelling of rich mahogany cedar and freshly pressed wool. The lighting was meticulously arranged to highlight rows of suits that cost more than Arthur's first mortgage. To anyone else, the opulence might have been intimidating, but Arthur had stared down foreign regulars in the dead of night. A room full of silk ties and Italian leather shoes barely registered on his pulse. He stepped further into the showroom. He was dressed in a faded, olive-drab canvas jacket, a pair of worn denim jeans, and scuffed leather boots that had seen thousands of miles of rough terrain. Atop his head sat a simple, black ball cap. It wasn't covered in flashy pins or boastful patches. It simply read, in small gold letters, U.S. Army Retired. Across the room, adjusting his cuffs in a three-way mirror, was Kyle Brentwood. Kyle was 22, impeccably groomed and suffocatingly ambitious. He wore a slim-fit charcoal suit that strained slightly at the buttons, a silk pocket square perfectly folded into a crown, and a heavy silver watch that he had leased to look the part of a high-rolling executive. Kyle wasn't just a clerk. He was the assistant floor manager, a title he held largely because his uncle owned the regional franchise. Kyle viewed Wellington and Croft not as a clothing store, but as a velvet rope. He was the bouncer, and he alone decided who belonged in his world of luxury and who did not. When the chime rang, Kyle turned a practiced, sycophantic smile ready to deploy. He expected a lobbyist, a senator, or perhaps a tech millionaire. Instead, he saw Arthur. Kyle's smile instantly evaporated, replaced by a deep, visceral sneer of disgust. He took in the old man's scuffed boots, leaving faint gray dust on the imported Turkish rug. He saw the faded green jacket. He saw the cap. "Oh, you've got to be kidding me," Kyle muttered under his breath. From behind the oak counter, Emily, a 20-year-old apprentice tailor with measuring tape draped around her neck, looked up. She noticed Arthur and immediately smiled, stepping forward to greet him. "Good morning, sir," Emily began. "Welcome to Wellington. And I'll handle this, Emily." Kyle snapped, his voice sharp enough to cut glass. He shot her a warning glare. "Go to the back and inventory the silk linings. Now." Emily hesitated, her eyes darting between Kyle and the elderly man. She recognized the hostility radiating from Kyle, but she needed this job to pay for her design classes. She lowered her eyes and scurried to the back room. Kyle smoothed his lapels, puffing his chest out as he closed the distance between himself and Arthur. He didn't walk. He glided like a shark approaching a wounded seal. "Can I help you find the exit?" Kyle asked, his voice dripping with condescension. Arthur stopped, his pale blue eyes locking onto Kyle. The eyes were striking clear, cold, and entirely unafraid. Arthur didn't flinch at the disrespect. He simply reached into his pocket and pulled out his reading glasses, sliding them onto his nose as he looked around the store. "I'm looking for a suit," Arthur said, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that commanded the space without needing to raise in volume. "Dark navy or black. I need it tailored by Thursday evening, Friday morning at the latest." Kyle let out a short, breathy laugh of disbelief. He crossed his arms, looking Arthur up and down with theatrical exaggeration. "A suit," Kyle repeated, as if the word itself was foreign. "Sir, I think you've stumbled into the wrong neighborhood. The Goodwill drop-off is 3 blocks down on Wisconsin Avenue. Or maybe you're looking for a surplus store. We don't sell camouflage here." Arthur didn't blink. He slowly reached into his inner jacket pocket. For a fleeting second, Kyle felt a spark of unease, a primal instinct warning him about the quiet old man's slow, deliberate movements. But Arthur merely pulled out a worn leather wallet. "I have cash," Arthur said simply. "I don't need camouflage. I need a suit for a funeral." "And I need you to understand," Kyle said, dropping the pretense of customer service entirely, his tone shifting into the patronizing cadence one might use with a slow child. "This is Wellington and Croft. The suits on these racks start at $3,000. The bespoke service is $5,000. We don't do layaway. We don't take IOUs, and we absolutely unequivocally do not offer a military discount." Kyle pointed a perfectly manicured finger at the cap on Arthur's head. "Yeah, I know how you guys operate. You come in here flaunting the hat, expecting everyone to roll out the red carpet and knock 50% off the price tag because you peeled potatoes on a base in Germany 40 years ago. Well, it doesn't work on me. Taxpayers already fund your health care and your pensions. I'm not subsidizing your wardrobe." In the back room, Emily stood paralyzed, listening through the slightly ajar door. Her grandfather had been a Marine, and Kyle's words made her stomach churn with nausea. She wanted to walk out there to defend the old man, but the fear of eviction kept her rooted to the spot. Arthur remained completely still. A lesser man would have yelled. A prouder man would have turned around and walked out seeking service elsewhere. But Arthur Donovan had spent his life completing missions, regardless of the obstacles. The mission today was a suit for William's funeral. This arrogant boy was merely an obstacle. "I didn't ask for a discount," Arthur said quietly. "I asked for a dark suit. Size 42 regular if I had to guess, though my shoulders might need taking in." Kyle's face flushed with anger. He wasn't used to being defied. In his world, his harsh words usually sent the less fortunate scurrying away in shame. The old man's stoicism infuriated him. It felt like an insult to Kyle's carefully curated authority. "Listen to me, old man," Kyle hissed, stepping uncomfortably close to Arthur. He could smell the faint scent of peppermint and old wool on the veteran. "I don't care if you have a shoebox full of crumpled dollar bills you've been saving since the Nixon administration. You are bad for the aesthetic of this store. You are tracking dirt on a carpet that costs more than your life insurance policy. Look at you. You're a relic. You're taking up space where real men of influence, men of power conduct their business." Arthur looked down at Kyle's expensive shoes, then up to his flushed, angry face. "Son," Arthur said, his voice dropping an octave, carrying the heavy, distant thunder of a seasoned combat commander. "You have no idea what a real man is. Now please step aside and let me look at the navy wool blends on that back rack." The word "son" snapped the final thread of Kyle's fragile temper. "Do not call me son," Kyle practically shouted, his voice echoing off the high ceilings and mahogany paneling. "I am the manager of this establishment. I am Kyle Brentwood. You are a washed-up entitled boomer clinging to some fake war stories, hoping people will pity you." Arthur's jaw tightened, just a fraction of an inch, but it was there. In Arthur's mind, a rapid montage of memories flickered, memories he usually kept locked in a steel vault in the back of his brain. He saw the red dirt of the Central Highlands. He saw William Henderson dragging him through mud, while tracer rounds snapped overhead like angry hornets. He saw the faces of the boys who never got to grow old, boys who would never have the luxury of worrying about the aesthetic of an Italian wool suit. Arthur took a slow, deep breath, inhaling through his nose. He forced his hands to unclench. "I am not leaving without a suit," Arthur said, his voice cold as ice. "Yes, you are," Kyle sneered, reaching out and grabbing Arthur aggressively by the shoulder of his canvas jacket. "I am personally throwing your pathetic freeloading self out onto the street. And if you resist, I'm calling the police and telling them a deranged vagrant assaulted me." Kyle squeezed the fabric of Arthur's jacket, preparing to shove the old man toward the door, but Arthur didn't move. Despite his age, despite the arthritis, Arthur's body was dense, with decades of hard muscle and muscle memory. When Kyle tried to push him, it was like trying to push an oak tree. "Uthi," Arthur looked down at Kyle's hand on his shoulder. "Remove your hand," Arthur whispered. It wasn't a threat. It was a promise. Kyle laughed nervously, his bravado wavering for a split second before returning. "Huh. Or what, Grandpa, you gonna call your nursing home buddies? You gonna tell me about how you fought in some pointless war we didn't even win? You people are all the same. Losers." Before Arthur could react, before Kyle could attempt to shove him again, a sound shattered the tension in the room. Ding! The heavy brass door at the front of the boutique swung open with such force that it slammed against the doorstop. The sudden noise made Kyle jump, yanking his hand away from Arthur's shoulder as he spun around instantly, reverting to his customer service posture. Into the pristine, cedar-scented air of Wellington and Croft stepped three men. The first two were built like brick walls. They wore identical, dark, tailored suits, but the way the fabric draped over their shoulders betrayed the bulk of body armor underneath. They had earpieces coiled behind their ears and eyes that scanned the room like predatory birds. They were military police elite protective detail, though to Kyle they just looked like serious high-end clients. "Welcome, gentlemen," Kyle called out immediately, ignoring Arthur and rushing toward the front of the store. "Welcome to Wellington and Croft. How may I be of—" Kyle's voice died in his throat. Stepping through the doorway, flanked by the two massive security men, was a figure that commanded the very oxygen in the room. He was a tall man, solidly built, with iron gray hair cropped close to his scalp. He wasn't wearing a suit. He was wearing the impeccably pressed dark blue dress uniform of the United States Army. The jacket was heavy with medals. Rows upon rows of colorful ribbons, gold badges and silver stars that caught the ambient light of the store. But it wasn't the medals that made Kyle's stomach drop. It was the shoulder boards. 4 large silver stars gleamed on each shoulder. Even Kyle, with his profound ignorance of the military, knew what 4 stars meant. This wasn't a local commander. This wasn't a retired colonel. This was a general of the highest possible rank. It was General Richard Kavanaugh, the current Chief of Staff of the United States Army. General Kavanaugh paused just inside the door. The 2 security men fanned out their hands, resting comfortably, yet warningly, near their waistbands. Kyle's brain went into overdrive. A 4-star general. Here, in my store, the dollar signs and the Instagram clout flashed before his eyes. He practically salivated. If he could post a picture of himself fitting a 4-star general, his uncle would promote him to regional director in a heartbeat. Kyle shoved past Arthur, nearly knocking the old man over in his haste to reach the front of the store. General Kyle beamed, bowing his head slightly, oozing with sycophantic charm. What an absolute profound honor. "I am Kyle Brentwood, the manager here. We are completely at your service. Please, whatever you need, the store is yours. Let me take you to our VIP fitting lounge." General Kavanaugh didn't even look at Kyle. It was as if Kyle were a pane of glass he was looking right through. The general's sharp eyes were fixed on the back of the store. They were locked onto the stooped elderly man in the faded green canvas jacket and scuffed boots. The general's expression, usually hardened by decades of global command and Pentagon politics, suddenly shifted. The stern lines around his mouth softened. A look of absolute awe, mingled with deep, unwavering respect, washed over his face. He ignored Kyle completely, stepping around the young manager, his polished black dress shoes clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. Kyle blinked, confused. "General, sir, the VIP section is this way." General Kavanaugh stopped 3 feet away from Arthur Donovan. The air in the boutique seemed to freeze. Emily, peeking out from the back room, covered her mouth with both hands. Kyle stood utterly bewildered, watching the most powerful man in the U.S. Army stand before the deranged vagrant he had just tried to throw out. General Kavanaugh squared his shoulders. He brought his heels together with a sharp crack that echoed through the quiet room. And then the 4-star general raised his right hand in a perfectly crisp textbook salute. "Command Sergeant Major Donovan." General Kavanaugh's voice rang out thick with emotion and reverence. "It is an honor to finally find you, sir." Kyle Brentwood felt the blood drain from his face, leaving him pale cold and entirely terrified. The silence in Wellington and Croft was no longer the hushed, expensive quiet of a luxury boutique. It was the suffocating heavy silence of an unexploded ordnance waiting to detonate. The ambient jazz music playing softly through the hidden ceiling's speakers suddenly seemed absurdly loud. Kyle Brentwood's lungs simply forgot how to operate. His mouth hung open, his perfectly white teeth exposed in an expression of raw, unadulterated panic. He looked at the 4-star general, rigid as an iron statue, his hand locked in a crisp salute to the brim of his dress cap. Then Kyle's panicked eyes darted to the old man in the faded canvas jacket, the man he had just threatened to throw into the street, the man he had called a deranged vagrant. Arthur Donovan didn't immediately react. He looked at the general, his pale blue eyes narrowing slightly, studying the face of the most powerful soldier in the United States Army. For a long, agonizing moment, Arthur just let the silence stretch. Then slowly, the stoop in Arthur's shoulders began to vanish. The physical transformation was subtle, but profound. The arthritis and the years seemed to melt away, replaced by a deep, terrifying muscle memory. Arthur straightened his spine. His chest expanded. The aura of the quiet, unassuming elderly man evaporated, replaced by the sheer, imposing presence of a seasoned apex predator. Arthur raised his right hand. His fingers, knobby and scarred, straightened perfectly. He brought his hand up the tip of his index finger, touching the edge of his retired veteran ball cap, and returned the salute. "Put your hand down, Ricky," Arthur said. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried a gravelly authority that seemed to rattle the crystal light fixtures. General Richard Kavanaugh snapped his hand down to his side, letting out a breath that sounded suspiciously like a dry sob. The stern, terrifying facade of the Pentagon Chief of Staff broke, replaced by the wide-eyed reverence of a young soldier seeing his hero. "I haven't been called Ricky in 40 years, Sergeant Major," Kavanaugh said, his voice thick with an emotion he was desperately trying to suppress. He took a step forward, completely abandoning military protocol, and grabbed Arthur by the shoulders, pulling him into a brief, fierce embrace. When Kavanaugh pulled back, he held Arthur at arm's length, his eyes scanning the old man's face. "I've had a team trying to track you down for a decade, Arthur. You fell off the grid entirely after the Pentagon ceremony in '85. No forwarding address, no VA records, nothing. You vanished into thin air." "I didn't vanish, General," Arthur replied evenly, his tone flat and devoid of sentimentality. "I just moved to a cabin in the Shenandoah Valley and stopped answering the phone. I had my fill of brass and parades. I preferred the quiet." Kyle, whose heart was hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird, finally found a fragment of his voice. His survival instincts kicked in, screaming at him to rewrite history, to smooth this over before the ground opened up and swallowed him whole. "General Kavanaugh," Kyle chirped, his voice an octave too high, sounding shrill and desperate. "Sir, there seems to be a profound misunderstanding here. This gentleman and I were just having a minor disagreement over our inventory. I had no idea he was an acquaintance of yours. Please allow me to escort both of you to the VIP suite." General Kavanaugh didn't turn his head. He didn't blink. He kept his eyes fixed on Arthur. "Sergeant Major Kavanaugh," said, his tone instantly dropping 50 degrees, returning to the ice-cold cadence of a supreme commander. Oh, who is this civilian speaking to me? His name is Kyle, Arthur said calmly, adjusting his jacket. He is the manager of this establishment, and until you walk through that door, Ricky, he was in the process of physically removing me from the premises. The air pressure in the room seemed to drop. The two massive security detail men, who had been standing at ease by the door, suddenly shifted their weight. Their eyes locked onto Kyle with terrifying, predatory focus. General Kavanaugh slowly turned his head. The look he gave Kyle was not one of anger, it was one of absolute clinical disgust. It was the look a man gives a cockroach before bringing his heel down. Physically removing him, Kavanaugh repeated softly, tasting the words as if they were ash. General? No, I swear it wasn't like that, Kyle sputtered, taking a step back, his hands raised in a placating gesture. Sweat was now visibly beading on his forehead, ruining his immaculate hairline. He was disruptive. He came in here demanding a military discount and insulting our clientele. I was simply trying to maintain the prestige of the store. You have to understand, sir, this is Wellington and Croft. Arthur let out a short, bitter chuckle. I didn't ask for a discount, boy. I asked for a dark suit. Size 42 regular. Kavanaugh took a single, deliberate step toward Kyle. Kyle instinctively retreated, his back hitting the edge of a mahogany display table. You were trying to maintain the prestige of the store, Kavanaugh said, his voice dangerously quiet. By putting your hands on Command Sergeant Major Arthur Donovan. Kavanaugh turned slightly, addressing his security detail, but ensuring Kyle heard every word. Gentlemen, do you know who this man is? No, sir, the taller of the two agents replied rigidly. That is because his file is classified higher than most nuclear launch codes, Kavanaugh said, his eyes drilling into Kyle's soul. In 1969, in the A Shau Valley, my platoon was ambushed by a reinforced battalion of North Vietnamese regulars. We were cut off. We were out of ammunition. We were dead men walking. Kavanaugh pointed a rigid finger at Arthur. That man, who was a staff sergeant attached to MACVSOG at the time, rappelled down from a medevac chopper under heavy anti-aircraft fire. He didn't have orders to do it. He just saw American boys dying. For 3 days he held a ridgeline single-handedly, with a heavy machine gun and a belt of grenades, bleeding from 2 shrapnel wounds, while we evacuated the wounded. He killed 64 enemy combatants. He saved 32 American lives, mine included. Kavanaugh took another step toward Kyle, pinning the young manager against the table. He holds the Distinguished Service Cross. He holds 3 silver stars. He was a founding member of Delta Force. He has bled into the dirt of 4 different continents so that entitled, pampered little cowards like you can stand in an air-conditioned room and worry about the aesthetic of your expensive carpets. Kavanaugh's voice finally rose, a sudden crack of thunder in the quiet room. And you dared to put your hands on him. Kyle was trembling. Actual visible tremors racked his body. His expensive charcoal suit felt like a straitjacket. He looked wildly around the room for any avenue of escape, any lifeline, but found only hostile eyes. General, please, Kyle begged, his voice cracking into a pathetic whine. I didn't know. He didn't say anything. Look at him, he's wearing a dirty jacket and old boots. How was I supposed to know he was a hero? He looks like a homeless man. Before the general could respond, a small, trembling voice cut through the heavy atmosphere from the back of the store. That's a lie. Everyone turned. Standing in the doorway of the back room was Emily, the 20-year-old apprentice tailor. Her face was pale, and she was gripping the measuring tape draped around her neck so tightly her knuckles were white, but her chin was raised in defiance. Kyle's eyes widened in furious betrayal. Emily, shut your mouth. Get back to the stockroom. He hissed, his instinct to bully reasserting itself for a split second. Do not speak to her. One of the security agents barked, stepping forward, his hand resting definitively on his holster. Kyle flinched, shrinking back against the mahogany table. General Kavanaugh looked at the young woman, his expression instantly softening into something paternal and encouraging. Go ahead, miss. Speak freely. Nobody here is going to harm you. Emily swallowed hard, stepping out into the main showroom. She refused to look at Kyle, keeping her eyes fixed on the general and the old veteran. "He didn't ask for a discount," Emily said, her voice growing steadier with each word. "He came in quietly and asked for a dark suit for a funeral. Kyle told him to go to a Goodwill drop-off. He told him we don't sell camouflage. He called him a relic, told him he was tracking dirt on the rug, and said taxpayers were subsidizing his wardrobe." Emily finally turned her gaze to Kyle, her disgust entirely visible. And then Kyle grabbed his shoulder and threatened to call the police and tell them a deranged vagrant assaulted him. Arthur watched the young woman, a flicker of genuine respect crossing his weathered face. It took courage for a civilian, an employee, to risk her livelihood to defend a stranger. He made a mental note of her bravery. General Kavanaugh closed his eyes for a brief moment, inhaling deeply through his nose. When he opened them, the raw fury had condensed into a cold, calculated judgment. He didn't yell anymore. He didn't need to. The quiet execution of his power was far more terrifying. "Major Miller," Kavanaugh said quietly, addressing the security agent who had spoken. "Yes, General." "Who holds the military contract for the ceremonial dress uniforms for the Joint Chiefs and the senior Pentagon staff?" Kyle gasped. It was a strangled, pathetic sound. Wellington and Croft didn't just sell suits to lobbyists. Their most lucrative, prestigious government contract, the one that kept this specific branch afloat during economic downturns, was providing the bespoke mess dress uniforms for the highest-ranking military officers in Washington. It was a multi-million-dollar account that Kyle's uncle had spent a decade securing. "I believe it is Wellington and Croft, sir," Major Miller replied smoothly. "Not anymore," Kavanaugh stated, his voice a steel trap snapping shut. Cancel it. Call the Quartermaster General immediately. I want every single standing order pulled by close of business today. Find us a tailor who understands what honor looks like." "General, no, wait." Kyle shrieked, dropping entirely to his knees on the expensive Turkish rug he had been so desperately protecting. The fabric of his slim-fit suit groaned under the sudden movement. "You can't do that. My uncle owns this franchise. If you pull that contract, he'll be ruined. He'll fire me. He'll kill me. I'll lose everything." Kavanaugh looked down at the weeping, groveling boy. There was no pity in his eyes, only the cold reality of hard karma. "Actions have consequences, son." Arthur spoke up, his voice cutting through Kyle's sobbing. "You spent your life measuring men by the price tag on their collars. You forgot to check the iron in their spines. You reap what you sow." "Call your uncle," Kavanaugh commanded, stepping back from Kyle as if the boy was infected with a disease. "Call him right now. Put him on speakerphone. Let him hear exactly why his legacy in this city has just burned to the ground." Kyle's hands shook so violently he could barely extract his sleek, expensive smartphone from his pocket. He tapped the screen with a trembling finger, dialing his uncle's private number. The phone rang twice before a booming, arrogant voice echoed through the store's pristine acoustics. "Kyle, make it quick. I'm on the golf course with Senator Davis. Have the quarterly numbers improved." Kyle let out a pathetic whimper. "Uncle Robert, there's a problem." "Mr. Brentwood," General Kavanaugh interjected, his voice carrying the unmistakable weight of command. "This is General Richard Kavanaugh, Chief of Staff of the United States Army." There was a profound, stunned silence on the other end of the line. The arrogance completely vanished from Robert Brentwood's voice. "General Kavanaugh, sir, to what do I owe the absolute honor? Is there an issue with your dress whites?" "The issue, Mr. Brentwood, is your nephew," Kavanaugh said coldly. 10 minutes ago he attempted to physically assault a highly decorated elderly veteran in your showroom. He insulted his service, humiliated him, and threatened to have him falsely arrested. He did what?" Robert Brentwood stammered, the horror bleeding through the speaker. "Kyle, tell me this is a joke. Tell me you didn't do this." Kyle sobbed into his hands. "Uncle Robert, I didn't know." "Shut up!" Robert roared through the phone. "General, sir, I am so profoundly sorry. I will fly back to D.C. right now. I will personally apologize. Whatever that veteran needs, it's on the house. Forever." "You don't understand, Mr. Brentwood," Kavanaugh replied softly. "Apologies do not fix a broken foundation. I am formally terminating the Pentagon's contract with Wellington and Croft, effective immediately. And I will personally ensure that every lobbyist, every senator, and every contractor in my orbit knows exactly why. General, please, it's an $80 million account. It will bankrupt the Eastern Division. Sakti. Robert screamed, his voice dissolving into sheer panic and rage. Kyle, you stupid, arrogant little brat. You are fired. You hear me? Pack up your desk and get out of my store. You're disowned. You're done. The line went dead. Kyle remained on the floor, weeping into the carpet, his entire carefully constructed universe shattered into dust in less than 5 minutes. He had thought he was the apex predator, the gatekeeper of luxury. He had forgotten the oldest rule of the jungle: there is always a bigger lion. Major, Kavanaugh said, not looking at Kyle. Have this civilian removed from the premises. He is disrupting the aesthetic of the store. Major Miller stepped forward, hauling Kyle to his feet by the scruff of his collar with effortless strength. Kyle didn't resist. He was entirely broken. He was marched out the heavy brass doors and deposited onto the cobblestone sidewalk of M Street, a weeping, humiliated mess, locked out of the velvet-roped world he had once ruled. With Kyle removed, the atmosphere in Wellington and Croft underwent a massive decompression. The stifling toxicity vanished, leaving behind the rich scent of cedar and the quiet dignity the establishment was supposed to possess. General Kavanaugh turned to Emily, who was still standing near the display tables, her eyes wide with shock at the speed and brutality of the justice that had just been dispensed. Miss Emily, Kavanaugh said gently, are you a tailor? Emily swallowed, stepping forward. Oh, I'm an apprentice, sir. I do the primary measurements and alterations. The master tailors do the final bespoke cuts. Today you are the master tailor, Kavanaugh commanded, though his tone was entirely respectful. Command Sergeant Major Donovan requires a dark suit, a perfect suit. I don't care if you have to rip apart the inventory to find the finest midnight navy wool in this building. I want him measured, I want it cut, and I want it perfect. Money is absolutely no object. I am putting this on my personal account. Arthur finally stepped forward, holding up a gnarled hand. Now hold on a minute, Ricky. I appreciate the fire support, but I pay my own way. Always have. Kavanaugh turned to Arthur, his eyes softening once more. The 4-star general looked for a moment like the terrified 22-year-old lieutenant shivering in the mud of Vietnam. Arthur, please, Kavanaugh pleaded softly, his voice barely above a whisper. Let me do this. You gave me my life. You gave me 50 extra years I had no right to have. I have a wife, 3 daughters, and 4 grandchildren who only exist because you held that ridgeline. Let me buy you a damn suit. Arthur looked into Kavanaugh's eyes. He saw the genuine, desperate need in the general's face, the need to balance a ledger that could never truly be balanced. Arthur was a stubborn man, proud and independent, but he was not cruel. He understood that refusing the gesture would hurt Kavanaugh more than taking a bullet. Arthur let out a long, heavy sigh, his shoulders relaxing slightly. All right, Ricky, you win, but nothing flashy. I'm not going to a gala. Where are you going, Sergeant Major? Kavanaugh asked, his brow furrowing. I know you hate cities. You haven't been east of the Mississippi in 30 years. What brought you down from the mountain? Arthur's jaw tightened. The cold, impenetrable mask he wore slipped just a fraction, revealing the deep, jagged reservoir of grief beneath. He reached into the inner pocket of his faded canvas jacket and pulled out the crumpled piece of paper, the funeral program. He handed it silently to Kavanaugh. The general took the paper, adjusting his reading glasses. As his eyes scanned the text, the color drained from his face. His posture rigidified once more, not in anger, but in profound sorrow. Captain William Henderson. Kavanaugh read aloud, his voice catching slightly on the name. Cancer, Arthur said quietly. The word hung in the air, heavy and blunt. Agent Orange finally caught up to him, fought it for 6 years. Stubborn bastard finally lost the high ground on Tuesday. Kavanaugh closed his eyes, bowing his head. William Henderson had been their company commander. He was the man who had ordered the medevac that Arthur had jumped out of. He was the tactical genius who had kept them alive when the brass in Saigon had written them off as acceptable losses. Arlington, Kavanaugh asked, his voice thick. Friday morning. Section 60. Arthur replied, his pale blue eyes staring past the expensive suits, looking at a phantom jungle only he could see. I owed him. He pulled me out of a burning track in '68. Burned his own hands to the bone doing it. I couldn't send him off wearing denim. Kavanaugh looked down at the crumpled paper, then up at Arthur. The shared history between them, written in blood and fire half a century ago, filled the opulent showroom with a sacred, untouchable gravity. You won't be sending him off alone, Arthur, Kavanaugh said fiercely. I will make the arrangements. The entire Joint Chiefs will be there. We will give him a full honors funeral. Case on riderless horse, the works. He deserves the absolute best of us. Arthur nodded slowly. He'd hate the fuss, but he earned it. Kavanaugh turned back to Emily, who was wiping a stray tear from her cheek, profoundly moved by the raw, unspoken bond between these two hardened men. Miss Emily, Kavanaugh said, his voice returning to its gentle authority. Take care of my friend. Give him the best you have. Yes, General, Emily said, her voice filled with conviction. She stepped forward, her measuring tape ready, her demeanor completely transformed. She wasn't an intimidated apprentice anymore. She had been empowered by the respect of giants. She looked at Arthur, gesturing respectfully toward the three-way mirrors. Right this way, Sergeant Major. Let's find you something fitting for a hero. Arthur offered Emily a small, rare, and surprisingly warm smile. He followed her toward the back of the store, the heavy scuff of his boots against the hardwood floor, no longer sounding out of place, but sounding exactly like what they were, the footsteps of a man who had walked through hell so others wouldn't have to. As Emily began to drape a bolt of the finest, darkest navy Italian wool over Arthur's broad shoulders, carefully measuring the drop of the fabric, General Kavanaugh stood guard by the front door. He crossed his arms over his chest, his 4 silver stars gleaming in the showroom lights, ensuring that for as long as Command Sergeant Major Arthur Donovan was in the building, no one would ever dare disrespect him again. In the hushed, cedar-scented confines of the VIP fitting room, the atmosphere was entirely transformed. It was no longer a retail space. It had become a sanctuary of quiet reverence. Emily, her hands trembling only slightly, guided Arthur Donovan to the center of the three-way mirror. If you wouldn't mind removing your jacket, Sergeant Major, Emily asked softly, her voice carrying a deep, newfound respect. Arthur nodded, reaching up with gnarled hands to unbutton the faded olive drab canvas. As he slipped the garment off his shoulders, Emily caught her breath. Even at 78, Arthur's frame was dense and powerful, heavily muscled from a lifetime of relentless physical labor. But it was the geography of his skin that made Emily pause. His torso and arms were a living ledger of violence and survival. A thick, jagged starburst of white scar tissue covered his right shoulder, where the A Shao Valley shrapnel had torn through muscle and bone. Long, faded silver lines crisscrossed his ribs and forearms, silent testaments to close quarters, combat razor wire, and the brutal reality of jungle warfare. He wore a simple white cotton undershirt, but it could not hide the profound physical cost of his service. Emily felt a sudden sharp sting of tears behind her eyes. She thought of Kyle's cruel words calling this man a freeloading relic. She realized with blinding clarity that the freedom to stand in this luxurious room, surrounded by imported silks and Italian wools, was paid for by the horrific permanent damage etched into the body of the man standing before her. She swallowed hard, composing herself, and raised her measuring tape. I'm going to make sure this sits perfectly over the shoulder, sir. I can pad the left side just a fraction of a millimeter to balance the drop, accommodating the injury. Arthur looked at her through the mirror, his pale blue eyes softening. He recognized the empathy in her voice, the careful way she navigated his scars without staring. You have a good eye, Emily. Most tailors just try to force the fabric. You adjust to the man. The fabric should honor the man, sir, Emily replied quietly, pinning the drape of the midnight navy wool across his back. Not the other way around. Out in the main showroom, General Richard Kavanaugh was systematically dismantling an empire. He stood by the front counter, his posture rigidly straight, speaking in low, clipped tones into his encrypted mobile phone. "I want the Wellington and Croft contracts severed," Kavanaugh instructed his logistics adjutant at the Pentagon. "Breach of conduct, moral turpitude, whatever clause you need to activate. Pull it. And have the provost marshal circulate a memo to all flag officers. I do not want a single piece of brass walking into any of their establishments nationwide." He ended the call, the final nail in the coffin of Robert Brentwood's $80 million legacy. Kavanaugh felt no remorse. In his world, loyalty was the currency of life and death, and disrespecting a man who had bled for the nation was a sin that demanded absolute biblical retribution. Meanwhile, less than a mile away, the immediate fallout of that retribution was already crushing Kyle Brentwood. Kyle sat on a cold, concrete bench in Farragut Square, his immaculate charcoal suit now wrinkled and stained with the sweat of sheer panic. He had tried to walk back into his leased luxury condo in Foggy Bottom, only to find his key fob deactivated. When he confronted the concierge, he was informed that his uncle's corporate fixer had already called, terminating the lease and instructing the building to box up Kyle's belongings for a freight shipment to a storage unit in Maryland. His phone, a device he usually used to flaunt his extravagant lifestyle on social media, was now an instrument of torture. He dialed his girlfriend, a junior lobbyist who loved the VIP access Kyle provided. "David told me what happened," she answered, her voice colder than the Potomac in January. David was Kyle's former best friend, another climbing socialite. "You insulted the chief of staff of the army. You put your hands on a legendary war hero. Are you out of your mind, Kyle?" "Babe, please, it was a mistake, I didn't know." "Don't call me that," she snapped. "My firm works with the Armed Services Committee. If anyone finds out I'm associated with you, I'm radioactive. Lose my number." The line clicked dead. Kyle stared at the black screen of his phone, his chest heaving with shallow, ragged breaths. In less than an hour, he had gone from a kingmaker of M Street to an untouchable pariah. He had no money of his own. Everything was tied to the corporate accounts his uncle had just frozen. He had no friends, only associates who fed off his proximity to luxury. He was 22 years old, and his life as he knew it was entirely irreversibly over. He buried his face in his manicured hands and wept the sounds of the bustling city around him, completely indifferent to his destruction. Back in the boutique, Emily stepped back from the mirror. "We have the measurements, Sergeant Major. I will stay here all night to cut and stitch this myself. It will be ready by Thursday evening. I promise you, it will be flawless." Arthur turned from the mirror, looking at the young woman. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a thick money clip. Before he could peel off a bill, General Kavanaugh stepped into the fitting room, shaking his head. "Put that away, Arthur. I meant what I said. This is on me. And if you try to hand her that cash, I'll have you arrested for insubordination." Arthur let out a low, rumbling chuckle, sliding the money clip back into his pocket. "You're getting arrogant in your old age, Ricky. Be careful, or I'll have to make you run the obstacle course again." Kavanaugh smiled, a genuine warm expression that erased the terrifying commander and briefly revealed the young lieutenant Arthur had saved. "I'd probably break a hip, Sergeant Major. Come on, let me buy you a steak. We have 50 years of catching up to do." As the two men turned to leave, Arthur stopped and looked back at Emily. He offered her a sharp, respectful nod. "Thank you, Emily, for your skill and for your courage today." Emily stood up perfectly straight. "It is the honor of my life, sir." Friday morning broke over Washington, D.C., with a crisp, biting chill. The sky a bruised, solemn gray that perfectly matched the gravity of Arlington National Cemetery. The rolling green hills, dotted with perfectly aligned white marble headstones, stood as a silent, eternal testament to the cost of freedom. In Section 60, the air was heavy, with the scent of damp earth and polished brass. A massive perimeter had been established, far larger than a standard burial service. Captain William Henderson had retired as civilian, a successful engineer who rarely spoke of his time in the Central Highlands. His wife Sarah and his 3 grown children had expected a quiet, dignified ceremony, with perhaps a few old friends. They were entirely unprepared for what General Richard Kavanaugh had orchestrated. Parked along the winding asphalt paths were rows of black armored SUVs bearing government plates and the distinct red flags of general officers. A full company of the Old Guard, the Army's elite ceremonial unit, stood in rigid, immaculate formation, their bayonets gleaming dully under the overcast sky. A riderless horse caparisoned in black stood restlessly, boots reversed in the stirrups, a symbol of a fallen leader. Sarah Henderson, clutching a tissue in her gloved hands, looked around in profound bewilderment as 3-star and 4-star generals took their places behind the family seating area. Then a sleek black town car pulled up to the curb. The rear door opened, and Arthur Donovan stepped out. If Kyle Brentwood had been there to see him, his mind would have broken trying to reconcile the image of the vagabond with the titan who now commanded the sacred ground of Arlington. Arthur wore the midnight navy bespoke suit Emily had crafted. It was without hyperbole a masterpiece. The heavy wool, draped flawlessly over his broad shoulders, tailored with such microscopic precision that it moved with him like liquid armor. The dark fabric accentuated his pale, piercing eyes and the stark white of his close-cropped hair. Pinned to the left lapel of the magnificent suit were his miniature medals. They were not boastful, but they were undeniable. The Distinguished Service Cross, second only to the Medal of Honor, 3 silver stars, 3 bronze stars with V devices for valor, 3 purple hearts. As Arthur walked down the path toward the gravesite, an incredible thing happened. The assembled generals, men who commanded fleets, armies, and global theaters of war, saw the medals. They saw the face. Word had spread rapidly through the highest echelons of the Pentagon about who General Kavanaugh had found in Georgetown. As Arthur passed them, these 4-star commanders, the most powerful military men on Earth, subtly shifted their stances. They didn't salute Arthur was in civilian clothes, but they straightened their spines, pulled their shoulders back, and offered him curt, deeply respectful nods. The active duty enlisted personnel standing guard actually snapped to attention as he walked by. Arthur barely noticed. His eyes were fixed entirely on the polished mahogany casket, draped in the heavy, vibrant colors of the American flag. He walked to the front row and knelt slowly in front of Sarah Henderson. The elderly widow looked at the imposing man, her eyes searching his weathered face. "Arthur," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Arthur Donovan." "Hello, Sarah," Arthur said gently, taking her frail hands in his massive, scarred ones. "William always said you were the prettiest girl in Ohio." He was right. Tears spilled over Sarah's cheeks. "He looked for you. For years. He just wanted to say thank you." "He didn't owe me a thing, Sarah," Arthur replied, his voice thick with an emotion he rarely allowed to surface. "He brought me home. I just came to see him off." Arthur stood and took his place slightly to the side of the family, standing shoulder to shoulder with General Kavanaugh. The 2 men stood like stone statues as the chaplain delivered the invocation, their minds transported back to a steaming, blood-soaked jungle, remembering a young captain with a radio in one hand and a rifle in the other, refusing to let his boys die in the mud. When the chaplain finished, General Kavanaugh stepped up to the podium. He didn't read from his prepared notes. He looked directly at the casket and then over to Arthur. "We are gathered here to honor Captain William Henderson." Kavanaugh's voice boomed across the silent cemetery, carrying the weight of command and profound grief. A man who understood that true leadership is not measured by rank, but by sacrifice. In the Ashau Valley, when the sky was falling and the earth was tearing itself apart, Captain Henderson did not falter. He was the anchor that held us to our humanity. Kavanaugh paused, his jaw tightening. There are men standing in this cemetery today who went on to wear stars on their shoulders, who only had the privilege of growing old because Captain Henderson and the men he commanded refused to surrender. We owe him our lives. We owe him a debt that can never in this lifetime or the next be fully repaid. Rest easy, Captain. We have the watch. The sharp, synchronized crack of the rifle volley shattered the silence, 3 volleys of 7 echoing across the Potomac River. The acrid smell of burnt cordite drifted over the gravesite. Then a lone bugler standing on a distant hill under an oak tree raised his instrument. The haunting, mournful notes of taps began to play, cutting through the cold morning air, wrapping around the hearts of everyone present. Arthur didn't cry. He didn't shake. He stood perfectly rigid, his right hand slowly rising to rest over his heart. He closed his eyes, and for a fleeting moment he wasn't a 78-year-old man in a bespoke suit. He was 21 again, covered in red dirt, listening to the chopper blades beat against the humid air, knowing he was going home because William Henderson had dragged him through the fire. When the flag was meticulously folded into a tight, crisp triangle and presented to Sarah on behalf of a grateful nation, the ceremony concluded. The crowd slowly began to disperse, the generals offering their quiet condolences to the family. Arthur waited until the area around the casket had cleared. He stepped forward, placing his hand flat against the polished mahogany wood. It was cold. "I'll see you at the rally point, Skipper," Arthur whispered into the quiet air. "Save me a bunk." He gave the casket 2 firm taps, turned on his heel, and walked away. 3 weeks after the funeral at Arlington, the landscape of Arthur Donovan's life had returned to its preferred quiet baseline. He sat on the creaking wooden porch of his cabin, nestled deep in the heavily forested foothills of the Shenandoah Valley. The air smelled of pine needles, wood smoke, and impending rain. Beside his rocking chair lay a massive, exceptionally well-trained German shepherd named Buster, who rested his heavy head on Arthur's worn leather boot. Arthur was back in his faded denim jeans and a heavy flannel shirt. The magnificent midnight navy suit, perfectly pressed and encased in a protective canvas garment bag, hung in the back of his cedar closet. He would never wear it again. It had served its purpose. It had honored William. He sipped black coffee from a chipped enamel mug, watching a pair of red-tailed hawks circle the thermal currents high above the tree line. He had received 3 letters from General Kavanaugh since the funeral: invitations to Gallus requests to speak at the War College, offers to consult at the Pentagon. Arthur had politely but firmly burned them in his potbelly stove. He had no desire to return to the world of men. He had done his duty, and he had found his peace. But the ripple effects of that singular morning in Georgetown continued to alter the lives of those he had left behind in the city. In downtown Washington, D.C., Emily stood in a sunlight-flooded loft space overlooking DuPont Circle. The room was empty, save for a massive, polished oak cutting table and several brand-new sewing machines still wrapped in protective plastic. She held a thick envelope bearing the official seal of the Department of the Army. Inside was a heavy, cream-colored card, signed personally by the Chief of Staff. It wasn't just a letter of recommendation. It was a golden ticket. General Kavanaugh had been true to his word. When he severed the massive government contract with Wellington and Croft, he didn't just hand it to another corporate giant. He used his discretionary authority to mandate a new vendor protocol for the senior staff's ceremonial uniforms, and he had personally financed the startup capital through a blind veterans trust for a new bespoke tailoring house. Emily wasn't an apprentice anymore. She was the sole proprietor of Donovan and Company Bespoke Tailors, holding an exclusive multi-year contract to design and construct the dress uniforms for the highest-ranking officers in the United States military. She had bypassed decades of corporate ladder climbing simply because she had possessed the moral courage to stand up for a disrespected old man when it would have been easier to stay silent. She ran her hand over the smooth wood of her new cutting table, a tear of profound gratitude slipping down her cheek. She knew she would spend the rest of her career ensuring that every stitch she sewed honored the legacy of the quiet, scarred titan who had walked into her life. Conversely, the universe had delivered an entirely different fate to Kyle Brentwood. 50 miles outside of the city, in a brightly lit, sterile strip mall in suburban Maryland, Kyle stood behind a laminate counter. He wore a cheap, ill-fitting red polo shirt made of synthetic polyester that chafed his neck. A plastic name tag, slightly crooked, rested on his chest. Kyle, trainee. He was working the returns desk at a discount big box retailer. His uncle Robert, true to his furious promise, had entirely excommunicated him from the family business and the family wealth. Without his trust fund, his corporate card, or his high society connections, Kyle had plummeted from the velvet-roped stratosphere of Georgetown directly onto the cold, unforgiving pavement of reality. He had been forced to sell his leased car to cover his broken apartment lease, and his social circle had abandoned him with breathtaking speed. "Excuse me," a sharp, irritated voice snapped, pulling Kyle from his miserable daydream. An older woman clutching a plastic bag containing a cheap toaster glared at him from across the counter. "I've been standing here for 3 minutes. Are you going to process this return or just stare at the wall?" Kyle felt the old, familiar surge of arrogant rage bubble up in his throat. He wanted to snap at her. He wanted to tell her that he used to manage accounts worth more than her house. He wanted to sneer at her cheap clothes and demand respect. But then the memory hit him. Like a physical blow to the chest, he remembered the cold, terrifying eyes of the 4-star general. He remembered the heavy, absolute gravity of the old veteran who hadn't needed to raise his voice to completely destroy Kyle's universe. He remembered the humiliating, soul-crushing reality of being physically thrown onto the cobblestone street, stripped of everything he thought made him a man. Kyle swallowed the bile in his throat. He forced his hands to uncurl from fists. He looked at the woman, his shoulders slumping in absolute defeat. "I apologize, ma'am," Kyle said, his voice quiet, stripped of all its former haughty bravado. "Let me take care of that for you right now." He scanned the barcode, the harsh beep of the register, sounding like the flat line of his former life. He had learned the hardest lesson of all: respect is not a commodity that can be bought with an expensive suit or a fancy title. It is earned through character forged in the fires of sacrifice, and it is a fatal mistake to confuse a quiet demeanor with weakness. Back in the Shenandoah Valley, Arthur Donovan finished his coffee. He set the mug down on the porch railing and reached out heavily, scratching Buster behind the ears. The massive dog leaned into the touch, letting out a contented sigh. Arthur looked out over the rolling green mountains, the endless canopy of trees rustling in the approaching wind. The ghosts of the Ashau Valley, the memories of mud and blood, and the piercing grief of losing William were still there. They would always be there, but today they were a little quieter. The ledger felt a little more balanced. He had done his duty. He had honored his captain. He had reminded a powerful man of his roots, elevated a courageous young woman, and taught an arrogant boy the true meaning of the word sir. Arthur leaned back in his rocking chair, closed his eyes, and finally, after 50 years of carrying the weight of the world on his scarred shoulders, the old soldier allowed himself to truly rest. The universe has an incredible way of balancing the scales, doesn't it? Kyle learned the hard way that true power doesn't need to shout, and the suit doesn't make the man. The man makes the suit. Arthur Donovan's quiet dignity and unimaginable sacrifice remind us all to never judge a book by its cover, because you never know what kind of hero is standing right in front of you. If this story of brutal karma, profound respect, and ultimate vindication gave you chills, do us a huge favor. Hit that like button, share this video to spread the message of respecting our veterans, and make sure you subscribe to the channel for more incredible real-life stories. Who do you think got exactly what they deserved today? Let us know in the comments below.